How do you do that, especially considering, I mean, I'm sure many people here have experienced the effects of high gas prices, or if not, if you're not driving around yourself, you've seen the cost of a flight or other things, and this has changed the political conversation, as you alluded to.
Yeah.
How does the Biden administration deal with that dynamic?
Well, the president is trying to deal with that, and he takes a fair amount of flack because people haven't sort of thought it through all the way to the end when he opens up the petroleum reserve, or when he tries to push for increased temporary pumping. We have to get through the crisis. And to get through the crisis, you need to obviously maintain political stability. You need to keep people aware and ready to move on the main issue, which is the climate crisis itself. I mean, the climate crisis doesn't stop because of Ukraine. And with coal use is going up in a number of different countries. Coal use is up 9% last year. Emissions are up 6% last year. It ought to be directly, opposite, and it's not. And so our enemy right now is, frankly, the status quo. It's people who want to take the path of least resistance, which happens to also be the path of greatest destruction. And that's where we're headed right now, unless we can turn it around. So, but there's a positive, exciting side to this, which is we left Glasgow in what was much more forward-leaning accomplishment than most people have caught on to. You were there, you covered it, and Time did a great job with it. And by the way, thank you to Mark Benioff and Time for their extraordinary leadership. But we left Glasgow with 65% of global GDP committed to keeping 1.5 degrees alive, with a legitimate set of plans to do so. And our task now is to bring the other 35% on. That's China, Russia, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia.
I just want to clarify for anybody here, Glasgow is the UN climate conference that took place last November, which was attended by governments from around the world. But
I made the mistake. This is the TIME100, and I assumed everybody knew.
Well, you never know. You never know. I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. But I do want to follow up just to ask. You're having these conversations. You're making these very important points. But the U.S. has, one might argue, lagged behind in following through on its own commitments, particularly with the Congress not passing a big climate spending bill as the Biden administration has intended to do. How do you communicate with leaders in other countries who might say, where are you on this?
Well, we're actually, I think, leading in a very important way, even though Congress has yet to pass legislation, which we're still hopeful can happen in the next weeks. I mean, it is possible. It won't be what was originally proposed, but it's possible that it could be really important to the effort. But the president has set critical goals, which are now being pursued. Let me give you an example. By 2035, our power sector will be carbon-free. And the utilities are not fighting that. They're joining in that effort. They recognize this is going to happen, has to happen. So we're going to go electric. And that is happening already. 75% of the new power brought online in the United States in the last number of years came from renewables. People don't realize that, even under Donald Trump. Why did that happen under Donald Trump, who'd pulled out of the Paris Agreement? Because governors and mayors, 37 governors and 1,000+ mayors, kept their cities and kept their states moving in the right direction. Ford Motor Company, General Motors, have spent hundreds of millions of dollars and are investing billions now to retool their factories in order to produce only, by 2035, electric vehicles. So, there's an extraordinary amount that is happening. The private sector, some people think it's heresy to talk about the private sector in a positive way, but I don't. I think the private sector right now is moving, in fact, faster than many governments around the world. There's almost $1 trillion of venture capital pursuing longer battery storage or direct air carbon capture or electrolysis that can go to scale to produce green hydrogen. They're just amazing things that are taking place around the world. You can't bet on it. You can't sit here and say, okay, I'm a public person, I'm going to bet on the technology. We have to deploy the technology we have today much more rapidly. And the IEA says we should be deploying renewables 5 times faster than we are. We should be transitioning out of coal 6 times faster than we are. We need to be deploying electric vehicles 22 times faster than we are. So we're behind. And the consequences of being behind, there's a terrific article, I think it's in today's New York Times or Washington Post, one of the two, about the consequences. David Wallace Wells writes about the consequences of not moving on climate. It is so much more expensive, so much more dangerous, so much more costly, and lives lost. 15 million people die a year from the quality of air. Greenhouse gases are air pollution. We used to call it pollution. And so if we turn that around, there's an enormous amount of benefit that comes to us. If we don't do it, we will be spending trillions of dollars for the consequences.
That's really such a critical point, is to acknowledge that the costs of inaction are much higher than the costs of acting. I want to ask just on the private sector very briefly, obviously there's been a lot of progress, as you alluded to, in the last few years. At the same time, we're in a period of market uncertainty. Large corporations have lost half of their value in some cases. Venture capital funding might be harder to come by. Are you concerned about market conditions affecting plan on progress from the private sector?
Well, of course. How can you not be? I mean, shareholders will begin to squawk, and people will pull back a little bit and look for safer and different kinds of investments, potentially. My hope is that the stalwarts will hang in there and recognize you can't do that, but also we're looking, this transition is not something to be feared, folks. It's to be embraced. It's the largest economic transformation potential since the Industrial Revolution. We have to redo energy all around the world. It's now the largest market, already the largest market in the world today. It's 4.5 billion to 5 billion users. It will go up to 9 to 10 billion users in the next 30 years. How often does any, ecopreneur or venture capitalist get to look at a market and say, wow, if I put my money here, there's a real future? Now, some people were ahead of that curve 10 and 15 years ago. They're not ahead of the curve now. Why? Because it's happening all around the world. Europe is ahead of us in terms of regulatory structure. Yeah. They're moving, 55% reduction. Europe, the UK will go for a 68% reduction in emissions. And Macron is doubling down on nuclear. UK wants to keep nuclear alive. Others have moved away, like Germany and so forth. So there's going to be a mixed reaction. But what I know is this: the greater risk to any capital in the marketplace is in not investing, not moving in this direction. It's not in moving in this direction. And we will get, I absolutely guarantee you, we will get to a low carbon, no carbon economy at some point in time. What I'm not confident about is whether we will get there to do what the scientists told us we must do, which is to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. You have to reduce emissions by 2030 by about 45%. 65% of the world is on track, at least with plans to be able to do that, now slightly discombobulated by events.
Right. You have some work to do in the next few months. I'm curious, we just have 2 minutes left, and I think in some ways this might be the most important question that I am going to ask, which is, here we're at the TIME100, we have a group of TIME100 honorees, as well as other, movers and shakers in their own fields. And the question that I often get, and I'm sure you do too, is what can I do as an individual? And I'm oftentimes reticent to answer that, but I feel like this crowd has a lot that they can do in their own individual capacities. And so my question is, on behalf of everyone, what can they do to move?
Well, it's more imperative than ever now, for a whole bunch of reasons, not just climate, that people make our democracy work. It doesn't work on automatic pilot. It takes people being involved. And people ask me often, why am I optimistic? Why do I think we can do this? Well, first of all, the climate crisis is human created. Anything that's human created is subject to human input, human course direction, change, et cetera. We can do that. And I think back, I was involved when I came back from Vietnam. I was involved immediately in Earth Day, 1970. And we brought 20 million Americans out of their homes on one single day, then sort of unheard of. And we targeted the 12 worst votes in the United States Congress in 1971, and labeled them the Dirty Dozen, went out and campaigned house to house, street to street, and in the next election, 7 of the 12 lost. What happened? Even Richard Nixon said, oh my God, this is a political issue, it's a voting issue. And there's nothing, after 28 years in the Senate, I'll tell you, there's nothing like an election where you see your colleagues falling by the wayside to put a little stiffness in your spine on a particular issue. And so we passed the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Marine Mammal Protection, the Coastal Zone Management, the Endangered Species, and we created the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States. We didn't even have that until 1972 when it came into law. Why? Because we made it mandatory for anybody who wanted to run for office. This was an issue. This is an 85, 80, 78% issue in America. Why is it not happening? The same reason you could ask about guns and other things. We have to elect people who want to move in the right direction. If you don't do that in a democracy, you're in trouble.
Well, we went through this time so quickly, but that is a great note to end on, and I think just to remind people to engage in civic life, and as well as to remind people about the costs of inaction versus the cost of acting. Thank you so much, Secretary Kerry.
Pleasure. Nice to be with you. Thank you. Thanks.
Please welcome Ceres CEO and President, Mindy S. Luber.
Great to be here and to see your faces. Good morning, everyone. Being together makes a huge difference. We're going to talk about climate change, which you're hearing a lot of. We all know that climate change is one of the most existential threats facing our global society today. We need bold, not modest, but bold and immediate. Timing matters. It cannot move slow. We need bold and immediate action from our world leaders, from policymakers, regulators, investors, and companies alike, if we're to avert the most catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis. The unfortunate reality is that these impacts will continue to affect communities of color and marginalized populations the most, those most underserved by our economic justice system, resulting in unjust and inequitable consequences. Our job is not only to solve climate, but to do so by advancing a just and an equitable set of climate solutions for our most vulnerable communities. And that has been part of the mission of Ceres of integrating sustainability into capital markets for decades. It is clear accomplishing this mission cannot be done alone, not by outsiders, insiders. We need governments to create enabling climate policies that will be essential if we're going to have a clean energy transition. We need those policies here and abroad. And businesses, starting with multinationals, the largest players, must make the right investments and take the right positions to achieve the solutions we need and the shift in our supply chain. I could say without question, tackling the climate crisis will require the ultimate public-private partnership and collective action from absolutely each and every one of us and each enterprise, company, business we work with. Companies like Citi are working with us to build a movement for ambitious and for collective climate action that is both responsible, fast-moving, and inclusive. We know that the net zero transition will look different for the developing countries, where there may be limited access right now to energy and to resources. We must come together around the world and meet their current social and economic needs without exacerbating existing inequalities. We also know that addressing climate change and economic inclusion do not have to be at odds with each other. That is an old myth to be put to bed. In fact, solving the climate crisis can and will be a driver of economic prosperity here and in the developing world. It will take all of us. Together, we must continue to innovate and to build a more sustainable future. Not only do the most vulnerable among us depend on it, but I will say as a mother of kids who are no longer kids, they're 27 and 31, we would throw ourselves in front of a bus if that bus were coming at our kids. This bus is coming at our kids. It is up to every single one of us to work on the solutions and find a way to deal with the catastrophic impacts of climate change. And with all of you here doing just that, I couldn't be more grateful. Thank you so much.
Please welcome Prime Minister of Barbados, the Honorable Mia Amor Motley, and Editor-in-Chief and CEO, TIME, Edward Felsenthal.
Hello.
Hello,
Welcome,
how are you?
Prime Minister.
Thank you very much.
The Prime Minister, as many of you know, has emerged as really the most powerful voice on the international stage, standing up for developing nations, and particularly island nations, against the climate risks that we just heard about in the previous sessions and will continue to talk about today. And we're very pleased and appreciative that you're here.
Thank you.
A short, recent bio. The UN gave you its top environmental award in December. You just won a landslide election for a second term. You led Barbados's.
Thank you.
You led Barbados's drive to become a republic in November, removing the Queen as head of state. You installed Rihanna as an official national hero, for which I think you deserve a third term. How do you, your agenda is so vast at home and abroad. How are you thinking about your priorities? What is your top priority as you look ahead this year?
To make life easier for our people in Barbados, the Caribbean, and generally the developing world. We don't have the luxury of focusing on one issue. We have to focus on all. And regrettably, we've faced three crises in the last few years. We faced the climate crisis, which is continuing and existential in a very real way. We faced the pandemic, which is COVID, but we're also facing the antimicrobial resistance slow motion pandemic, which people don't talk about, and which we speak about because it's responsible already for 1.2 million deaths a year directly and 5 million deaths indirectly. And thirdly, we've faced the consequences of the war that has broken out this year, which is being seen in inflation, particularly food inflation, energy inflation. You seeing it here in the US. And indeed, that's going to lead, in our view, to crises with financing and debt. So
It's a lot.
it's a lot. And in 2018, when I addressed the UN, I said, look, the world is looking too much like 100 years ago, but we know better. So we've got to find a way of creating space to ensure that those people who are on the margins of development, largely because of their history, largely because we've not had the kind of equitable, strong leadership globally that sees people, hears people, and feels people, we got to keep fighting for them, and that's what we're trying to do.
you may know the Prime Minister has given two really viral addresses, very powerful addresses, first at the UN and then in Glasgow, which, as we all just learned, is the COP26 meeting. One of the things I appreciate, you being in the business of words myself, is that words matter.
Yes.
And I was thinking as I prepared for this conversation, I could spend the whole time just quoting you to you. But I wanted to ask you a question that you wrote and was part of your COP26 speech that we all watched and were inspired by. And the question you asked, after you said try harder, was, are we so blinded and hardened that we can no longer appreciate the cries of humanity?
Yeah, that's why I try to keep it simple. We need to see people, we need to feel people, we need to hear people. And too often in this world, we are so narrow-focused. And regrettably, technology reinforces that now. Decades ago, people broadcasted. Now people narrowcast. So people listen to what they want to hear, invariably things that they already believe in. And therefore, we're not building that platform to bridge the differences, whether it is the differences on the perspectives on climate or any of the other major issues. And I think more and more, we need to learn the art of building dignified bridges to be able to ensure that humanity can come together in that common space. And before this goes further, I really want to thank TIME. I don't see you're recognizing me as me. I see you're recognizing me as recognizing a message that is coming from the developing world and coming from Barbados and the Caribbean. And I want to thank you for having the courage to recognize that message, because we need more people globally to accept that if we simply continue as is, we already have a cementing of what the world looked like in 1945. We didn't exist as a nation, nor did over 100 countries. And just because we become independent nations doesn't mean that the institutions have changed to accommodate us. They haven't. That's why we're fighting for change in the World Bank. An International Bank for Reconstruction and Development can't simply be about low-income countries in today's world. We have a number of global problems. And unless we can find global solutions to global problems and finance them globally, they will become problems to even those who think they're insulated from them. And that's kind of where we are at today's point. And we need not only leaders in government, but we need ordinary people creating the noise and creating the pressure in order to move the needle in domestic governments, such that internationally we can have global financing for global public goods. We can ensure that the world is a safe place, that the world is an equitable place.
I asked Secretary Kerry in the back, who of course you know well, what he would ask you. And his question is a good one. It's, could you describe for us, take us to Barbados?
I'd love all of you to come.
Please.
We're in the business of welcoming people, so please.
I meant that figuratively, but thank you.
And I meant it literally.
Climate.
Yes.
We talk about it as, and Mindy was just talking about it as a bus coming at us and from the future, but there's a present.
Very much so.
And what are you experiencing in your country as an example of the challenges faced by countries like yours all over the world? What are you seeing? What is happening on the ground that is alarming to you?
To begin with, it's not climate change, it's a climate crisis. Secondly, we are crowding out our ability to bring development to our people. The Sustainable Development Goals are just simply what we would want for our people in terms of development. If we have to spend money recovering from a climate crisis, then we have less money to go into education, less to go into health, less to go into other areas of development. Last year in Barbados, on April 9th, we had the eruption of the volcano in St. Vincent, 90 miles away, But Barbados' airport closed for a week, and our port closed for 5 days because day turned to night when the volcano erupted and the ash came, and it affected literally everything in terms of equipment. 6 weeks later, we had a freak storm at 1:45 in the morning. If I wasn't up, I wouldn't have believed it. We had 46,000 lightning strikes in 90 minutes, and we had thunder coming from the bowels of the earth. And 2 weeks later, we had our first hurricane in 66 years. Now, I thank God, I don't have any wood to touch. I thank God that that hurricane moved over us in less than 2 hours. If it had done what Dorian did to Bahamas, where it sat on top of Grand Bahama and Abaco for 2 days, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you today. So these things are real. This is our present. When you ask us to deal with financing of net zero, people forget that we're already highly indebted countries, most island states. Why? Because we've been carrying the cost of climate for a while now. And we're carrying the cost of the G7, formerly G8 countries, industrialization on our balance sheets, and it's wrong. And nobody's making the room to ensure that we get access to grants. We can't borrow if we have no fiscal space easily, and the cost of borrowing is also prohibitive. So that what we've said, look, we need international solutions to international problems. We need an international balance sheet that takes away this debt, because when we do it, we crowd out our development and the SDGs being part of our national program. And that is our present. That's not our future. So that if we can resolve these issues in an equitable way, let's take private law. If you lived next to me and you dumped on my property, I would have a legitimate claim against you for nuisance or for tortious interference. Internationally, we have nothing to rely on other than morality. And that's why I say that the world needs global, moral, strategic leadership. And that's why I say that ordinary citizens ought now to demand, because while we in the islands are the canaries, you are soon going to be the victims of that. Which country is hit by a hurricane every year? Do you know? The United States of America. Every year. It's just different states. Our countries in the Caribbean, we play lotto or roulette as to which one will be hit. But I would have thought that given the exposure of the southeastern and eastern seaboard, that there would be a greater compelling framework for us to treat to these issues. And when you add to it the floods you had here in this city, and you add to it the fires in the West, and you add to it the groundwater crisis here and throughout the Americas, it's the same issue.
Right. If morality is not going to achieve it, you would think self-interest would, but...
Well, I think self-interest will. The question is, as you heard from just now, Mr. Kerry, will it be in time for some? And that is our message.
We hear
will
a lot.
It be in time for some?
We hear a lot about the momentum out of COP26 going into COP27, which is going to focus, is intended to focus on some of these finance issues in particular. Do you think there's momentum? Are we going in the right direction or the wrong direction?
I think that generally we've stalled a bit, and the war in Ukraine has also brought that about. Look, when gas prices go up in the way in which they've done, energy prices, food prices, people will do what they have to do to survive. And they're not going to remember that in many instances, doing the right thing sustainably is not exactly cheaper today as we would like. And hence, you're going to probably see, you heard what was happening last year when the world resumed activity from 2020, but even then, we've gone in the wrong direction. With this year now, with the war and with the food crisis potentially, and with the energy crisis, I suspect that you're going to see some more difficulties. But I also want to say that the world needs a balanced conversation too, because net zero in 2050 does accept and admit of fossil fuels to the tune of 20% of overall energy requirements. We see natural gas as that clean bridge, we see hydrogen. But here's the problem. If we go all lurching in one direction, it means that only those suppliers today can finance their way to net zero. And there are a number of developing countries that are being left out of the opportunity to be able to see how natural gas can play that role for them. Because whether we like it or not, people still have to live until you reach where you want to reach. So it's a complex discussion, it's a nuanced discussion, and it can't be captured in 4 column inches or 60 seconds.
I want to ask you as a last question, we're almost out of time. You are, let me get this right, the chair of the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations,
Yep.
appointed so by the heads of the Caribbean community. And you said recently that you'd be writing to European countries about the unresolved issue of reparations. Have you done that? And
No,
where are we?
We literally paused it because of the war in Ukraine. And we felt that to start the discussion at this stage may be a little complex. But the issue is not going to go away. It's not me that chairs it, it's Barbados that chairs it. Barbados is that country where modern racism in the Americas started when the British literally settled in the 17th century. In 1661, the parliament which I lead passed the heinous slave code that spawned other slave codes here in the US, either directly mimicked or in part indirectly. And we feel that we have a moral obligation to be able to start to deconstruct the racism in all of its forms. It doesn't only come in laws that are still there, but it also comes in ways in which people undermine democracy, in ways in which people prevent people from voting, in ways in which people make judgments about people because of color or race. And we've got to work hard to deconstruct it. And we have to also recognize that when many countries became independent, there was no development compact or development package left for us to finance education, healthcare, or any of these issues. But when the slaves were emancipated, 20 million pounds was paid to the slave owners, and then by reason of a 4-year apprenticeship scheme, another 27 million pounds of free labor was given. Now, if we were to take the example of Haiti, which is perhaps the most egregious example there is, where the French government took back from Haiti, and I think New York Times did an article recently.
Very powerful, yes.
That's right. So you know that even though Haiti declared independence, they then had to pay the French government for a significant period of time a portion of their customs duties. And yet Haiti today has never recovered. And we have to ask ourselves, can we accept that the Industrial Revolution was financed by the blood, sweat, and tears and money of developing countries, and at the same time causes the climate crisis today? And it's a case of double jeopardy. So we had the wealth taken from us, and now we are facing the consequences of that wealth's impact on the Earth's climate. It's wrong, just simply wrong.
I want to thank you. I want to invite you. You can have many times more than 4 column inches anytime you want it in time.
And I want to invite you to Barbados and everyone else here.
We'll all see
I think
you
we
in
have a
Barbados.
deal.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.